Did she say anything?
Well, when she came...
She didn't say a thing. I told you before, she went into the bedroom and didn't say a word.
She was the wife Hollywood wanted you to forget. He was the legend they protected at all costs. Behind the glamour, the fame, and the carefully staged photographs, something violent and heartbreaking was happening, and no one dared to speak about it. So what really happened inside the marriage of Humphrey Bogart and Mayo Methot? And why did Hollywood work so hard to bury the truth? Stay tuned, because what really happened between them is far darker than anyone ever imagined. Before she ever met Humphrey Bogart, Mayo Methot was already a name worth remembering. She was not just some fading actress clinging to a famous husband. She had earned her place in the spotlight. Born in Portland, Oregon, Mayo made her stage debut at the age of 5. By her teenage years, she was already captivating audiences on Broadway with a commanding voice and a sharp, no-nonsense attitude that set her apart. Critics praised her for her bold performances and emotional depth. She was confident, ambitious, and fearless, a rare combination for any actress during the early 1930s. In an era where women were often cast to smile and step aside, Mayo was making headlines on her own terms. She had grit, she had presence, and behind that tough exterior was a deeply passionate woman determined to prove herself in a world that often demanded silence from women like her. She earned the nickname the Portland Rosebud, charming to the public but not easily tamed. When Mayo finally made her way to Hollywood, she was not looking to be rescued. She signed with Warner Brothers and appeared in a string of supporting roles. While the parts may not have always been glamorous, Mayo brought an intensity to the screen that made her stand out even in the smallest scenes. She was not your typical ingenue, and producers knew it. Then came 1936. She was cast in a film called Marked Woman, and on that very set, she crossed paths with another actor whose name was rising fast in the Hollywood scene, Humphrey Bogart. He was sharp, witty, and charming in that distant, smoldering way audiences loved. Off-camera, he had a dry sense of humor and a heavy drinking habit to match. The chemistry between them was immediate, undeniable, and dangerous. They fell for each other quickly. It was not the sweet, romantic courtship the magazines loved to print. It was messy, intense, and wild. Two headstrong personalities who shared a thirst for alcohol and an allergy to obedience. Friends warned them both this would never end well, but they did not listen. Got married just months after meeting, and for a brief moment, it seemed like two equally tough souls had found their match. Hollywood, at the time, was obsessed with the idea of power couples. But with Mayo and Bogart, it was not about red carpets and public appearances. It was about passion, fire, and control. And while the cameras flashed and fan mail poured in, behind closed doors, something darker was brewing. But what started as a passionate whirlwind quickly spiraled into something much darker. As the honeymoon phase wore off, the cracks in Humphrey Bogart and Mayo Methot's marriage began to show. And fast. Both were heavy drinkers, and neither had the temperament to back down from a fight. When things were good, they were electric, but when they were bad, they were explosive. Hollywood insiders began calling them the Battling Bogarts, and it was not a nickname made in jest. Their arguments were legendary, loud, violent, and often terrifying. Mayo's jealousy was white-hot. She saw the way women looked at her husband, especially as his career began to climb. He was no longer the struggling supporting actor she had first met. Now, he was rising fast. And Mayo, once the bigger name, was slipping further into the background. She accused him constantly of cheating, and sometimes she was right. But it was more than that. It was about losing control, losing relevance, and watching the man she loved become someone she no longer recognized. The fights were not just verbal. Objects were thrown. Glass was shattered. Neighbors heard screaming through the walls. According to multiple reports, they once pulled knives on each other during a drunken argument. Another time, Mayo allegedly stabbed Bogart in the shoulder with a hairpin. Friends witnessed black eyes, bruised arms, and silent dinners that chilled the air. Bogart, for his part, was no saint in these moments. He was cold, dismissive, and emotionally unavailable. When cornered, he would retreat into silence or whiskey. He would disappear to bars, return home late, and act as if nothing had happened. His way of winning an argument was simply refusing to acknowledge it. That only made things worse. Still, somehow, they kept going. It was chaos, but it was theirs. The studio's publicity machine, ever protective of its leading men, spun their dysfunction as fiery romance. Tabloids published grainy photos of them walking side by side, hinting at tension, but never daring to say more. Most of the public had no idea how violent it really was behind the scenes. One day, police were called to their home after a neighbor reported screaming. When officers arrived, both Mayo and Bogart insisted it was just a misunderstanding. No charges were filed. It was not the first time, and it would not be the last. In those days, especially in Hollywood, domestic violence was not a scandal. It was an inconvenience. Friends of Bogart would later recall these moments with a strange kind of nostalgia, laughing them off as the price of passion. But those closest to Mayo knew the truth. She was unraveling, and the world was watching, not to help, but to judge. But even that was not enough to make Hollywood intervene. In any other profession, what happened between Mayo Methot and Humphrey Bogart would have made headlines for all the wrong reasons. But in the 1930s, Hollywood image was everything, and Bogart was becoming too valuable to fail. Warner Brothers, the studio that had Bogart under contract, saw the growing chaos in his marriage not as a moral concern, but a public relations problem. And so they did what Hollywood did best. They covered it up. Studio fixers were assigned to keep tabs on the couple and intervene before anything could reach the papers. They paid off gossip columnists. They threatened photographers. They carefully fed the press stories that painted Bogart as a hard-working actor and Mayo as the unpredictable wife standing in the way of his greatness. It was not about truth, it was about control. Inside the studio system, power ran top-down. Bogart was becoming a box office draw, and that meant the machine would protect him at any cost. Mayo, meanwhile, was increasingly viewed as a liability, difficult, dramatic, and above all, disposable. She had once been a rising star, but now she was seen as just another angry woman standing between Hollywood and one of its future icons. When violent incidents occurred at home, they were never reported to the press, at least not accurately. One insider recalled that publicists kept a list of approved talking points in case anyone asked about the couple's fights. Everything was rewritten as passionate disagreements or domestic tension blown out of proportion. The reality, broken bottles, screaming matches, bloodied lips, was quietly erased. Even the nickname, the Battling Bogarts, became a kind of joke in the press, something to be laughed at rather than questioned. Columnists would write lines like, "Looks like the sparks are still flying in the Bogart household," as if physical violence was some quirky marital trait. Audiences ate it up. No one asked for details. What few people knew at the time was just how coordinated the silencing was. Mayo had tried, more than once, to go public about the abuse and the emotional toll it had taken on her. But every time, the stories were pulled, the quotes removed, or the interviews edited beyond recognition. Bogart's handlers made sure her voice never reached the public in full, and perhaps most damning of all, even Bogart's closest friends played along. They mocked Mayo behind her back, calling her Sluggy, a cruel nickname referencing her drunken outbursts and supposed love of throwing punches. It stuck. Even decades later, people referred to her that way without ever questioning what had really happened behind closed doors. Mayo, once fierce and outspoken, began to shrink in the public eye. Her career offers dried up. Her friends stopped calling. Even as Bogart's star soared, hers vanished without a trace. And while Hollywood buried the truth, Bogart was already drifting into another woman's arms. By the early 1940s, Humphrey Bogart was a full-blown movie star, but his personal life was collapsing. While the public still believed he was trying to make things work with Mayo Methot, behind the scenes, he had already begun looking elsewhere. That elsewhere came into sharp focus in 1944 on the set of To Have and Have Not. She was 19. Her name was Lauren Bacall. From the very first read-through, Bogart was captivated. Bacall was young, elegant, and composed, the polar opposite of Mayo. She was also an unknown actress on her very first film, and Bogart took it upon himself to guide her. Their chemistry on screen was undeniable, but it was what happened off-camera that truly rattled everyone who knew them. Bogart and Bacall began spending long hours together. Rehearsals turned into private dinners. Notes became love letters. And yet, Bogart was still married. Mayo knew, Of course, she knew. She had always been sharp, always aware of the energy in a room, and something had shifted. She reportedly showed up on set more than once, watching silently from the sidelines with a cigarette in one hand and a drink in the other. She was angry, wounded, and humiliated. At one point, she confronted Bogart in his dressing room and screamed loud enough for crew members to hear through the walls. No one intervened. No one ever did. What made it worse was the studio's reaction, or lack of one. Warner Brothers executives actually encouraged the Bogart-Bacall pairing. From their perspective, it was a publicist's dream. Bogart, the hard-boiled leading man, and Bacall, the sultry new starlet, it was box office gold. Mayo, with her wild reputation and increasingly erratic behavior, was a problem they were eager to phase out. She no longer fit the story they wanted to sell. Bogart began spending more nights away from home. Mayo was often left alone, stewing in rage and heartbreak. Friends said she started drinking more heavily than ever before. One of them even claimed she stopped answering her phone because she could not bear hearing another person ask, "Have you seen the papers?" The affair continued in plain sight. Bacall, though still barely out of her teens, was already being shaped into the perfect counterpart to Bogart's image. The studio put them on magazine covers. Fans swooned. No one asked what had happened to the wife he still legally had at home. When Mayo confronted Bogart directly and demanded he choose, he did not even pretend to hesitate. He left their shared home, filed for divorce, and never looked back. There were no public apologies, no statements, no regrets. He simply moved on. And just like that, the woman who once stood beside him, in fame, in love, in war, became a footnote in his story. And the way he ended the marriage was colder than anyone imagined. When Humphrey Bogart finally filed for divorce, he did not cite mutual disagreements or irreconcilable differences. Instead, he placed the blame squarely on Methot'S shoulders. He accused her of drinking too much, of being emotionally unstable, and of damaging his public image. There was no mention of his own behavior, no acknowledgement of the countless nights he vanished into bars, or the cruel silences he weaponized during their worst fights. To the world, Bogart was moving on from a problem, not a person. The divorce was finalized in 1945. Just 11 days later, Bogart married Lauren Bacall in a quiet ceremony in Ohio. Mayo was not invited. She received no letter, no call, no closure. She only found out about the wedding when she read it in the paper. And when she did, something in her seemed to break for good. The settlement Mayo received was modest. By Hollywood standards, it was a slap in the face. Bogart had money, and plenty of it, but there was no interest in making her feel secure. Friends later said she felt discarded, not just as a wife, but as a human being. Her phone rang less. The producers who once promised her second chances stopped returning her calls. The studios had picked their narrative, and she was not part of it anymore. In public, Bogart's new marriage was treated as a glamorous redemption. The press could not get enough of Bogey and Bacall. They were young love, Hollywood royalty, the perfect match. Mayo, meanwhile, became a punchline. She was painted as the bitter ex-wife who had ruined her own life. Most people had no idea what she had been through, and fewer cared to ask. As Bacall's fame rose, Mayo's health and reputation crumbled. The years of stress, alcohol abuse, and emotional trauma were catching up to her. Friends watched helplessly as she spiraled into deeper depression. One even said Mayo had no center of gravity anymore, like she had been stripped of everything that anchored her. She attempted a return to the stage, but the offers were weak and sporadic. She was typecast as either the loudmouth or the drunk, never the woman she had once been, full of fire and ambition. She stopped appearing in public. She stopped trying to prove herself, and eventually, she stopped trying altogether. Those who did see her in those years described a shadow, someone who barely resembled the woman they had known. She had once been quick-witted, sharp-tongued, and always ready for a fight. Now, she barely spoke. Her eyes, they said, looked hollow. But what she did in the years after shocked even those who knew her best. After the divorce, Mayo Methot faded from public life with a speed that was almost cruel. She left behind the sound stages, the screaming matches, and the spotlight. But what she entered was something far lonelier. By the late 1940s, Mayo was living alone in a modest apartment in Portland, the same city where she had once been crowned the Portland Rosebud. The name no longer fit. The spark was gone. Her health declined quickly. Years of alcohol abuse had taken their toll, both physically and mentally. She suffered from chronic depression, and the few friends who remained worried she was slipping into something she could not return from. She was no longer working, no longer acting, and no longer fighting. She just stopped trying, stopped reaching out, stopped living in any meaningful way. There was no comeback, no redemption arc, no dramatic return to the stage. Mayo simply disappeared, and Hollywood let her. It was more convenient that way. She had become a ghost of herself, of her marriage, of everything she had once represented. She did not make headlines anymore. She did not draw crowds. In the eyes of the public, she had ceased to exist. When she died in 1951, it was quiet. There were no tributes from the Academy, no memorials, no Hollywood stars flying in to pay their respects. Her passing was marked by a few short paragraphs in the local papers, and even those focused more on her failed marriage than her once promising career. She was 47 years old. The official cause of death was cirrhosis of the liver, but many believed she died of something slower, heartbreak. In her final months, neighbors reported hearing her talking to herself late at night. They said she would sit by the window for hours, smoking and staring out into the street. She never remarried. She never wrote a tell-all. She never tried to clear her name. One of the few people who saw her regularly during that time claimed Mayo kept a small box of photos near her bed, all of them of Bogart. Despite everything, she could not let him go. She had been betrayed, humiliated, and erased, but part of her still loved him. Or maybe she just loved who he had been when they first met, before the fame, before the studios, before the lies. In the end, Mayo Methot became a silent casualty of Hollywood's golden age, the kind of tragedy they never wrote into the scripts. And perhaps the most devastating part is not how she died, but how completely she was forgotten. But the real question remains, was Mayo truly the villain, or just the easiest one to blame? In the decades that followed, Humphrey Bogart was transformed into something larger than life. The brooding anti-hero, the face of film noir, the man who made tough look romantic. Hollywood built a myth around him, and in that myth, there was no room for Mayo Methot. She was edited out of the picture, left behind like an unwanted chapter in a best-selling novel. The legend of Bogart and Bacall became iconic. They were portrayed as soulmates, a rare example of true love in the ruthless world of fame. Classic film retrospectives, biographies, and documentaries focused almost entirely on Bacall, young, elegant, loyal, the perfect partner. And Mayo, if she was mentioned at all, it was in passing, with words like troubled, unhinged, or violent. No one questioned where those labels came from. No one bothered to ask what her side of the story might have been. This rewriting of history was not just cruel, it was calculated. Biographers often leaned on studio-approved accounts, most of which had been carefully curated to keep Bogart's legacy intact. Even respected film historians repeated the same language. Mayo was difficult. Mayo was jealous. Mayo was the reason the marriage failed. But what about the violence, the manipulation, the years of emotional unraveling that no one stepped in to stop? Bogart's abusive behavior was softened by the culture. His drinking was part of the charm. His temper was part of the persona. He was allowed to be complicated, while Mayo was simply dismissed. The double standard could not have been more glaring. Bogart's flaws were forgiven. Mayo's defined her entirely. Even the nickname Sluggy, once used mockingly among Bogart's circle, found its way into biographies, without context, without apology. It stuck like glue, and with every retelling, the public perception of Mayo Methot became less about who she really was, and more about what they wanted her to be, the unstable woman in the way of a Hollywood romance. But in recent years, something shifted. A handful of writers, critics, and film scholars began asking tougher questions. They looked past the polished narratives and started digging deeper into studio archives, old interviews, and forgotten police reports. What they found was unsettling. a clear pattern of suppression, bias, and silence. And tucked away among Mayo's final belongings was a letter, handwritten, unsigned, unsent. It was addressed to Bogart. In it, she poured out everything: grief, anger, regret, and still love. She never mailed it. Maybe she was afraid he would not read it. Or maybe, deep down, she knew he never deserved it. Either way, the letter said what no headline ever did: that behind the bruises and bitterness was a woman who still felt everything, even after Hollywood stopped feeling anything for her. Hollywood gave us an icon in Humphrey Bogart, but to do it, they buried a woman's pain so deep most people never even knew it existed. Mayo Methot was not perfect, but she was not disposable either. She had a voice. They just made sure we never heard it, and that might be the most heartbreaking part of all.